So today we are starting a new series, and I will say right up front, as you can see on the screen, this is introduction. So it's going to be very basic introductory points for today. It's going to be different in the previous times, in different Sunday school series, because there'll be times when we have lessons that are more history focused, and then other times when we get more into, there's portions of God's Word that correspond with various things we're talking about. And today, it is more of just some introductory points. So we're not purposely neglecting the Bible. It's going to be a mixture when you're dealing with history, and particularly church history. There's times when we just look at the history, look at some principles, and then other times we get into God's Word. And so it will be a mixture as we go along through here, but a lot of it's going to be history. But it's very important history because when you have history is important not just for church history, but it's important for any type of history, a nation's history, even a single church's history, a family history. My wife has been, she was before I had to send her laptop off for repair, but she had been taking advantage of the free Ancestry.com service through the library that through the end of June, I think it's through the end of June, you can access it, Greenfield residents can access it at home for free. And so normally I guess you can access it for free at the library. But so she's been doing that. She's been learning a bit about her family history, particularly on her dad's side. And speaking of Father's Day, and so dad's side, and it's very interesting to look down through and see the various things that have taken place. And one of the things you can do that's helpful for family history is that you can know what some of the weak areas in a family are. You can maybe see some of the good things, the strong areas of a family. And she noticed as she's gone down through the last few generations on her dad's side, there is a particular characteristic of the men in that side of the family. And so very interesting to see that. But how do you know that? How can you know that? Well, you look at the history. And how can we know about churches, the history of the churches? How can we know, first of all, where churches have come from, and then also where we are today? Knowing where churches have come from help us know where we are today, and then it also can help us to press forward for the future. And so that's the importance. And we're going to get, actually, that's a lot of the introduction today is the value of church history. That's really the main focus, is the value of church history. And I'm probably a little rusty with the computer and the PowerPoint because it's been a while since I've used it. So I'm going to get ramped back up into using this in having a lesson based on PowerPoint. I'm not going to be passing out notes. It's going to be an outline, so to speak. Part of it is I don't know what we'll cover in a given week, so it's going to be up to you if you want to take notes, to take your own notes. And so today we're just going to focus very basic on the value of church history, like I said, by way of introduction. And first of all, the value of church history is that it is spiritually challenging. It's spiritually challenging, is to help us to be able to see the good, the bad, the problems, and help us maybe to avoid some of the pitfalls. And then also looking at the good things that have happened over church history, or even, actually maybe not even good things, but maybe they're bad things that happened to people that were being faithful, and it can challenge us spiritually to increase in our commitment to the Lord. When you think about, even when you read Hebrews chapter 11, the end of Hebrews chapter 11 talks about what so many different believers went through, and that should be spiritually challenging to us, is that if we were faced with a situation that our life was being threatened just simply for being faithful to the Lord, for being a Christian, how would we respond to that? How would we handle there are people in history, they have gone through just absolutely, Christians in history, and even there are people today, they go through horrible, horrible things. And that should be spiritually challenging to us, because we should be thankful for the relative amount of freedom that we have as Christians. Certainly there's an increasing amount of hostility in our country toward the Bible, toward God, toward Jesus Christ, but we still don't see that same amount of just outright persecution, people being killed for their faith in the United States, as we've seen through history and in other parts of the world. But at the same time, there's also, in the early part of our nation's history, there were Christians who were facing persecution, who were beaten, put in prison. And so it should be spiritually challenging to us. It should be encouraging to us in the sense that there are people who have gone before, who have faced many things, and it should be a challenge to us then to live closer to God, to really examine ourselves and see how committed am I? If that was to happen, am I more concerned with self-preservation? How would I approach that? How would I respond? And there's a saying that says that don't say that you'll die for Christ if you're not even willing to live for Him. And people that aren't willing to live for Christ certainly aren't going to die for Christ, and they will fold pretty quickly and just go along with the flow the best they can in the interest of self-preservation. The second thing is it encourages faith in God, because when you see history, and someone came up with this at one point in time, that history is His story, God's story of the whole outworking of His plan for the ages, and so it's God working through man, through history, through mankind, throughout history. And it should encourage our faith in God, because we can see how God has preserved churches and preserved the fact that we still have the Bible today, the fact that we still have churches today. The devil has worked very hard to stamp out the Bible, to stamp out Bible-believing churches, and he still hasn't done it. Now, he might squish them smaller and smaller. He might use different tactics to try to make them less effective and less powerful. That's a big problem today, is that many churches just don't have any spiritual power in them anymore. But there still are Bible-believing churches with the touch of God on them that are faithful to His Word, and should encourage our faith in God when we see how He has worked throughout history. The next thing is it helps protect us from doctrinal error. It helps protect us from doctrinal error. And in other words, there are no new heresies, just old ones revived and repackaged. No new heresies, just old ones revived and repackaged. I'm interested in economics, the financial situation in our country, and various things economically, and I was reading, I've been reading a book about the Federal Reserve, and one thing that was helpful is to understand, looking at history, to understand that what we see today really isn't new. It's been going on for hundreds of years in our country, just in different ways. It's kind of the same things get repackaged, the same things get tried again. And that's what helps us with church history, is it can help protect us from doctrinal error in recognizing the root of many of the false doctrines that are in existence today. We can see that there have been false doctrines around for a long, long time, and it can help protect us when we see the origins of those false doctrines. The next is that it helps develop analytical thinking and keen spiritual discernment. As the book of Proverbs speaks of, is knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. You're not going to have wisdom if you don't have understanding, and you can't understand something you don't know. And if you know history and you understand history, then you can also have the wisdom to put it into practice. It'll help develop your spiritual discernment. It should help develop your spiritual discernment, keen spiritual discernment, and being able to analyze what you're seeing. And there's really some of the things of history that we got to be careful, because there's a lot of history revision out there. And one of them was, I saw the person who has been really the vocal person in Greenfield for the Black Lives Matter movement, shared a post. I I was wanting to look up a little more about this person and shared a post about, I don't know how old the post is, but this woman in Texas, this teacher, whoever in Texas, talking about how racist the Mercator map projection is. Did you know that the Mercator map projection is racist? You've seen that?
She's changing the map.
Yeah. It's absurdity of absurdities. But this is proof that there is systematic oppression and systematic racism in America, and it's absolutely absurd. And to say that this is proof, I mean, you see that because Greenland is bigger than the rest in the middle part in South America. It's bigger than Greenland, but look how big Greenland is. And this shows, and her reason was, this woman who did the video, she said it was because the Pope wanted that map created to show the spread of Christianity. That's why the Mercator map was, have you ever heard that before? I mean, that was news to me. And all you have to do is look up the history. It was for the purpose of navigation. It was a seafarers. Because of the way that it was laid out, it was helpful for seafaring, navigation. It had nothing to do with racism, and it had nothing to do with Christianity, Catholicism, the Pope, or anything like that. It's the most absurd thing. Now, someone could make the argument that's not the best projection, the best type of map to use in a classroom setting. Somebody could say that. I'd say, sure, yeah, if there's a better projection to use for school, then certainly use a different kind of map projection. But obviously, there are people who have not developed analytical thinking and keen discernment. That they would even fall. And this video has like 2 million views overall since the time it's been posted. And it's this older woman in Texas just talking about just how, and she cut off one side of the map because supposedly, according to her, the United States was in the middle, so she cuts off one side and it belongs over here, and there's all kinds of, it's nonsense, absolute nonsense. But that is what is going on, and according to this person, that is proof of racism and systematic oppression in this world against different ethnicities, and so. We need good analytical thinking and keen spiritual discernment because there's a lot of lies out there, and so studying history, and we got to make sure we have an accurate perspective of history, can help us in that. We need that discernment. And it helps us to be more balanced in our thinking. Another aspect, let me go back a second, spiritual discernment. Oftentimes, deception is put forth under the guise of truth. So, for example, the Catholics said that those that rebaptized were heretics. Those who would rebaptize, those who would baptize by immersion, those who had been sprinkled as infants. They were called heretics. And so, is there truth to the fact that there are heretics? There are, but deception was put forth saying, well, these are the heretics because they were the ones rebaptizing. Then it helps us to be more balanced in our thinking. All churches in history have had imperfections and faults. There's never been a perfect church throughout the history of the churches. And so studying church history can help us have the right perspective based on what is important. Help us have the right perspective of what is important based on the truth. And so it helps us then to understand there's not going to be let's find the perfect church. Let's find the perfect church. What we need to have is the discernment to see what churches had the foundations, the basic Bible doctrines that were and I hate to even say the most essential, because if it's in the Bible, it's essential. At the same time, there are certain doctrines of greater consequence. For example, the doctrine of baptism, there's a big difference between infant baptism and believer's baptism. That's a very consequential doctrine. And so, but there are other churches, but there are churches throughout history that they've had imperfections and faults, and there won't be a church that doesn't have imperfections and faults, except when everybody's together with the Lord. Then all the imperfections and faults will be taken care of and ironed out and everything. But it helps us to be more balanced in our thinking, in having the right perspective of what is most important based on the truth. Some other observations about church history. So we go from the value of church history to observations about church history. Is that the first is that most of the greatest heroes and heroines of the faith are known only to God. Known only to God. We're not going to find detailed records about who are the greatest heroes in God's sight. And the reason is those who were the greatest heroes, those who were the most faithful, they weren't the ones who wrote the history. The ones who killed them were the ones who wrote most of the history. And so they want to stamp out that memory. And that's why it's oftentimes when looking up church history, it is more difficult to find. But it's out there. It's out there. It's just not going to be the most readily available in the sense of what is church history. Even those who were the dissidents, even those who the Roman Catholics called heretics, weren't necessarily the strongest Bible believers of that day. Just because the Catholics called somebody a heretic didn't mean that was the strongest Bible believer. There were even others who aren't even mentioned much at all throughout history who were even stronger in their faith. And that same is true today. And the ones who get the most publicity aren't necessarily the most famous in God's eyes. You know, just because one church has, 15,000 members or 15,000 attendees or 15,000 or 50,000 YouTube views or Facebook views does not mean that they are the strongest churches of the day. And most of the ones who are the most faithful are not on the radar of mainstream Christianity or mainstream media. And in the example of independent Baptist churches, most of the time, the only time independent Baptist churches, most of the time when they make the news is when there's a problem. And when there's a controversy and when there's a scandal. The news loves covering that. But other than that, they're not talking about what the independent Baptist Bible-believing churches are doing. And even, like I said, you could look up a lot of so-called Christian media, and they're not going to really focus on that as well. They're going to be more focused on the mainstream, just regular, big-name people. And that doesn't necessarily mean they are the most famous in God's eyes. Another observation about church history is that the record of most Bible-believing Christians of old does not exist. Does not exist. In other cases, much that once did exist has been destroyed. And so once again, because they were not, the Bible-believing Christians of old were not the ones who wrote most of the history. I mean, when you're just trying to stay in hiding, or you're trying to not draw the undue attention from the powers that be that are trying to kill you and persecute you, you're not usually as interested, and you're not going to have as much time to write, and it's not going to be on the forefront of your mind as writing the history of what's going on. And you're just trying to survive and just live for God. And I think the same is often true for today. Could we use a little more balanced history, or a little more history of the true Bible-believing churches, Bible-believing Christians? Could we use a little more of that today? Well, certainly. But oftentimes, the most Bible-believing Christians, the strongest churches and the strongest Christians, they're just busy serving the Lord, that they're not necessarily concerned about writing about themselves most of the time. Now, some people are good at journaling, and that's all good. I'm not particularly strong in that area, so don't look for any lengthy historical record from me. There are some better ones. We have a couple of kids who are writing trying to write things down, and my wife's definitely better at that in the sense of journaling throughout her life. And I kind of tried it one time, and that went by the wayside real quick. I still have the file on my computer, so if I want to go back and fill in a few blanks, but probably wouldn't get too much down. So that's my theme, is take a picture. It lasts longer. That's how I remember. I go back and look at pictures. But then what if I forget to take pictures? Then that's it. But there are oftentimes people are the living for the Lord the most. They're just busy living for the Lord. They're busy with their families. They're busy in their church. They're busy just with their life, and they don't have as much time to write that down. If you have the time, if you do that, that's great. But history is important. It is important to remember church history and the history of Bible-believing Christians. And many Christian groups are known by the names of various leaders, but that doesn't mean that the groups actually followed a man. Oftentimes the names were given to them by their enemies. And so whether it's my mind is blanking even as to some examples, but we'll get into some of them as we go along. But they're just because there's a group that had the name of a and I'm talking about farther back in history. There are some in the last 100, 200 years that are named after a man that usually it's someone else gives that name, is what I'm trying to say, is that it's not you. They don't usually give that name themselves, but sometimes it is a means of identification in that because this was who was leading them, but doesn't mean they actually followed a man. In certain cases, it does mean that there was a man whose doctrine influenced that group. So sometimes referring to them, for example, Calvinist, someone's a Calvinist, it's usually, oftentimes that's a reflection of following certain doctrines. It doesn't mean they're, revering John Calvin or have a statue of John Calvin or something. Same thing with Arminianism. There's Jacobus Arminius, and so that's a recognition of a certain way of thinking, a certain doctrinal perspective, and so those are just a couple of examples. But also, the various groups of Christians known in history weren't necessarily organized movements, and they were just groups that they're just trying to do what God says to do as far as what the church is supposed to do. And so they weren't necessarily trying to create this movement to sweep across the land like their particular movement. They were just trying to faithfully serve the Lord. And so that is often the what goes on today. Though there is more of a movement based focus on not always in churches, but even just throughout society. It's always about a movement. There's various movements that pop up, but as far as the groups of Christians in history, they weren't necessarily organized movements. Even if they had a particular name attached to them, it didn't mean they were out trying to get their movement. They're just wanting to follow the Lord and obey His word. Some more observations about church history. The various groups of Christians weren't strictly divided. They overlapped and interacted. So throughout history, we kind of, just for the sake of learning, we might look at one group and say, all right, this is the character, this is who led this group, this was the leader, here's what this group was like, here's their history, here's where they were located. And then we might look at another group, but that doesn't mean they were all 100% separate from each other. And no Bible-believing group in history existed in a vacuum. Believers often find other like-minded people to associate with, but there are other groups that exist at the same time. The same thing, that's true today. I mean, I could even just tell you in the Independent Baptist kinds of churches. There are various groups where there's closer realms of fellowship, maybe certain groups of associations, pastor fellowship, church fellowships. At the same time, there is also overlap where it's not, well, I am just of this Bible college or I am of this group. There is some overlap. So there's certain aspects in which, based on commonality, like-mindedness, maybe geographical location, there is going to be a greater unity among certain people, pastors, churches, and then at the same time, that doesn't mean they're just completely exclusive from others as well. And so that is true today. Tracing the exact origins of various groups is not important. Every biblical church ultimately originates with the Bible and Jesus. So this is important because there are some who believe, and I don't know how great of a number this is, but there are some who believe, and usually Baptists, that you got to be able to trace your church back through a particular line. And it has to have, there's that unbroken chain all the way back to the apostles. And you can't prove that. Some have claimed that they can prove that. I don't see how you can prove that because there are groups that have come and gone over the years, and I don't know that how you can completely prove that. So tracing the exact origins of various groups is not important. It is based on, you view these groups, we need to view these groups based on how biblical were they? How biblical were they? And that is the key. Same thing is true today with a church. The issue is not what is its family tree, but how biblical is it? How is it organized biblically? Does it have a biblical structure to it? Is its doctrine biblical? That is what the greatest importance is. There may have been churches that were not biblical for a while, and then over time they actually, maybe a different pastor came in, different leadership, and they actually were able to then turn that church to a more biblical church. Does that mean that they are an illegitimate church now? That maybe if they're a biblically organized, biblically led church with Bible doctrine. So we're not necessarily looking to trace the exact origins of various groups. The most important thing to understand is that there always have been Bible-believing Christians, faithful Bible-believing Christians since the time of the apostles, that there have always been. It's not a matter of having to connect, figure out how they all connect to each other. It's that there always have been since then. There was much variety within the various groups of Christians, and so there are certain names in history such as Waldensian, Albigensian, and Lollards, and they were broad names that encompass many types of churches. And it's the same thing today, and I've really tried to practice this, is just because a church is called by a certain name, you can usually figure out what a church is about based on what it's called if they have a certain label in their name. And there is something to be said for that. But there were some Waldensian churches that practiced believers' baptism, while there were others who baptized infants. And so it's important not to get in this tunnel vision of hearing a word, hearing a name or a term, and just automatically thinking either all bad or all good. And today there are many kinds of Baptists. Many kinds of Baptists today. There are some that I would wish that they wouldn't even call themselves Baptists. There was I think I told Russ about this the other night. In Canada, it's supposedly a Baptist church. This pastor, I shouldn't even say, I don't want to corrupt the children's minds. What he announced to his church family on Zoom, it was not just single perversion, it was a double perversion, and about him personally. And And that's not what it means to be a Baptist church. I mean, that is completely against the heritage of what it even means to be a Baptist. He's far from God's Word. The guy's probably not even saved. And that's unfortunately, there's a lot of that even in so-called Baptist churches today, particularly the American Baptist church's denomination is a very, there's a lot of apostasy in there. So just because a church has the name Baptist on it, you still got to check out its doctrine. You still got to check out its, what they're about, and so just don't take a name and assume when it comes to those types of churches that either all bad or all good. There's still a name is still important though, because it is trying to communicate something. So if we call ourselves a Baptist church, that's because we are communicating, we are identifying with the heritage of what Baptists have believed historically. But we need to remember there was much variety within the various groups of Christians, and we need to recognize that today, that there still is a lot of variety. I'm sure you know that. And then also, I've just mentioned this already, but it isn't possible to trace a lineage of true churches back to the apostles. It's not possible to trace a lineage of true churches back to the apostles. There's some, like I said, who believe that that's possible. I've never really looked that deeply into it, because as far as I'm concerned, it's not important. What's most important is to understand there always have been faithful churches, faithful Bible-believing Christians all through history, and in one shape, in one form or another, in one group or another, there always have been. And also understand the term heretic in church history can refer to false teachers or to true believers. So when we hear the word heretic regarding church history, the Roman Catholics and maybe some other groups as well refer to the true believers as heretics. Does that mean they were actually heretics? No, they weren't heretics, but they were called heretics. Understand that was one use of the word heretic. But then also know that in church history we would call false teachers heretics, and that they have teaching that is apart from God's Word. It is not according to the truth of God's Word. A true heretic teaches doctrine contrary to the Bible, but the Catholic Church called true believers heretics. Terms such as bishop, baptism of children, and monastery must be understood in their proper context. And so a bishop, there's the biblical word bishop, which is referring to a pastor, but there's also the bishop talking about a hierarchy in a denomination or a religion, or an archbishop. And so understand those in their context, that there is a biblical way to use the word bishop, but then there is an unbiblical way to use the word bishop. Also, same thing with the baptism of children. If we're talking about sprinkling of infants, then that would be one way of one context. But then there's also the just those who are youth who have already believed and were baptized. And then the story of church history, and this is the last one for this morning. The story of church history. I couldn't get through here without a mistake. I'm disappointed. First lesson, already a mistake in the PowerPoint. Because I'm human. Yeah, there's no perfect churches and there's no perfect humans either. So, the story of church history is a continual process of apostasy and separation. That's the other thing to understand and observe, is that you'll have groups that were faithful for a while, and then they fell away. And then there was another group, takes its place in a lot of ways, faithful, and then they fall away. So the Waldensians are an example of that. And there, even today, you see there are those who have been faithful, and then there are those who fall away. And then there are those who have separated. Because of the apostasy, there would maybe be a group that broke off and tried to stay faithful, tried to stay true. And one example of that, there's actually a couple examples of that even just among Baptists, is that back in the 50s, there was an exodus from the Southern Baptist Convention of the more conservative pastors and churches, because they saw some problems in the Southern Baptist Convention even back then, and they broke off, and really that influenced what we call the Independent Baptist movement of today. And so they broke off because they saw the direction of that convention. And I'm not a fan, by the way, I'm not a fan of a huge convention anyway. It's a lot of it's centered on money and power and prestige and influence and all those things, just the bigness of it. So, but there were those who broke away. Then, perhaps even out of some of those who broke away, if they started to fall away, then there are others who would then stay faithful and separate from another group. One example is the Baptist Bible Fellowship International, BBFI. And they had been very strong in the 60s, 70s, really had a good solid heritage as far as their foundation and their doctrine. But then they started getting more worldly. They started compromising. They started falling away. And so then there were some pastors in the 90s, especially in the 90s, closer to 2000, who said, all right, we're pulling out of this association. We're pulling out of this fellowship. And the bigger an organization gets, whether it's a fellowship, a denomination, or whatever, to me that increases the likelihood of it falling away. Because it's just with bigness, and when you have all of these people all these different groups coming together, it's more likely there's going to be compromise. And so they pulled away. But what about the Independent Baptist churches of today? Well, there are plenty of causes for concern, even in the Independent Baptist churches of today, that you can see the slide in some of them, slow but unfortunate. There is a decline. We have a book over there in the library called Why Most Independent Baptist Churches Will Be Emerging Within 20 Years. And I forget when that was written. A few years ago it was written. And he lays out the reasons, and I think he's right as far as the reasons for the downward trend. And so that's the story of church history. That's the story of church history, is the continual process of apostasy and separation. And so once again, it's good to understand that, to have that observation, to say it's nothing new when you say, that group they were sound at one point in time, but they're not sound anymore. That church was sound at one point in time, but they're not sound anymore. And that's nothing new. That is nothing new. And one of the greatest battles of having a biblical church is keeping it a biblically strong church, a biblically sound church. That's one of the greatest battles. Just like in your own Christian life and in families, is going to the next generation, having a next generation that is going to be just as strong, if not stronger. That's a big battle. That's a struggle. Because most of the time it gets weaker. Generations get weaker as time goes on. It takes a deliberate effort for that not to be the case. But if just left to itself, that's what happens. It's usually weakness, not strength, in following generations, and that has happened in churches. There have been churches where the pastor or the father who was strong and sound, and then later on turns the church over, his son becomes the pastor, and then what happens? Downward it goes. Downward it goes. And that's happened a lot. And so just more worldliness and compromise. And that is what's, rather than just staying strong and consistent all the way through. And so that happens. That happens. But it takes effort. It takes a deliberate choice that is not going to be that way, or at least by the grace of God, the best that we can do. Of course, in future generations, we can't. There's certain things that sometimes are out of our hands. We can at least try to train the next generation to be strong, the next generation of leadership, and to try to not have that happen, that there would be apostasy that would require separation. And that is the story of church history, however. So that is the introduction to church history. And we like I said, just the basic principles of getting the foundation, getting going, and then starting next week, we'll actually delve into church history starting at the time of the apostles, and then go from there. And it's very interesting to know, and Christians should be interested in church history so we can learn from it. We can be enriched by it. We can be challenged and strengthened by it, and we can then take that knowledge and learn from it and go forward to apply what we need to apply. And maybe if we see mistakes in the past, try not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but then take the good examples of the past and apply them to our lives as well.